there is hope everywhere in every square centimeter of Africa. And we have to make this hope real for everybody, for the benefit of the world, but also for the benefit of Africa.
Welcome to the Harmony of Interest series, where we explore ideas that shape our world. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer for Empathy Media Lab that publishes content on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we are a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Ako Essan Emile, who is based in Democratic Republic of Congo, but he is from Cote d'Ivoire. He is a senior project manager for Search for Common Ground. And Ako was a 2019 Obama Foundation Leader for Africa. He was also a 2019 Institute for Economics and Peace Ambassador and a 2015 Young African Leaders Initiative Washington Fellow. I met Ako around the 2015 elections in Cote d'Ivoire to document his work around a community radio station promoting peaceful messages ahead of the country's presidential election. That experience taught me a lot about the history of Cote d'Ivoire, and I'm lucky to have become friends with Ako. So great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too.
So could we begin by talking about where you grew up and what were some of the influences that led you to peace building?
Well, thank you so much, Ivan, for this opportunity to talk with you. Well, you said it. I'm Ako Emile. I'm an Ivorian, but I work currently in the DRC. Well, I grew up in a village, which is now progressively becoming a town. It's known as Abongwa in eastern Cote d'Ivoire. My grandfather, who was an old man, was, basically the first figure who nurtured me, in addition to my mother and my stepfather. So I developed quite a strong bond with my grandfather at the time when I was, when I came to Earth. He was already very old, so he could barely walk. And people joke saying that I became his legs because he will send me everywhere, in the village to carry his messages to people in the family and across the village. So he used to tell me tales and also his own experience, his own lived experience, all the way from the colonial era till this was in the 90s. So from the colonial era, I didn't know really his age, so I can't say exactly when, but based on the stories the stories that he told, I think this were around the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. So yeah. Then, well, I went to school. I went to school in the same village, being under, living with my grandfather. I went to the primary school. I started reading, and these stories helped me to develop a kind of a sense of curiosity. So I think this is curiosity, but also empathy, because he was an old man, very patient, and he was respected by people, but at the same time, he tried to teach, things like traditional values. You have to respect elder people. You have to respect people with specific needs. So don't mock people, don't disobey people, and all these, I think, helped me to develop a kind of empathy. And as you know, empathy is one of the key ingredients in peace building. About specific peace building, growing up in the village, we did not have a media. The only media I had access to were old newspapers that were available in a local shop. So I used to go to the shop, collect these old newspapers, and I encountered, at the time there was the Liberian and Sierra Leonean war going on. The Liberian War started in 1989 and went on to 2003, and the Sierra Leonean War was almost around the same time. So in these newspapers, there were a lot of articles and pictures about the war in Liberia, and these really were was my first encounter with armed conflict. And when I will read articles, I will discuss with my grandfather. He was old, he couldn't read or write, but based on his own experience, he could interpret, comment, and then give me directions or sometimes complain about, how wicked people can be against other people and everything. I think this was the very first, um, encounter with this desire to work for a better community.
And and
But
just
my influence,
and just to
yeah, yeah,
interject, a lot of people's geography is so poor, especially in the United States, but Liberia is just to the west of Cote d'Ivoire. And so you share the
yeah.
border with.
Yes, we share border with Liberia exactly. So
So the
actually
civil
Western Cote
unrest
d'Ivoire.
even carried over, and a lot of people were fleeing violence, ended up in Western Cote d'Ivoire.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, that's it. And okay, so in addition to that, my mother also influenced me. She's quite a courageous woman, and she instilled in me courage, hard work, and determination, which are also key ingredients for conflict management and in the field of peace building. The influence of my stepfather, I think it was basically he was the one who sent me to school and pay my tuition from primary to the university. So I think it's a combination of these three people that made me growing up. My grandfather passed away in October 2003 when I just obtained my first secondary school diploma, and this was a very defining moment in my life, and it was my childhood hero, in fact.
And I also got to see a little bit of your personal side when I came to visit, and I saw you in a church. And from my understanding, you started learning some translation, and that for me was a very special experience to see you up there, both translating, but then also preaching as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to learn English as another language?
Well, thank you. I learned basically English at school. We start learning English basically at the secondary school level in Cote d'Ivoire. So when I went to secondary school around 1999, 2000, so I started learning English. So English was merely a subject at school. So I learned English, but quickly my teachers appreciated me. They thought I was a good student in English, so they encouraged me, and this also, this encouragement helped me to choose English when I entered at the university. So I studied English at the university for 4 years before the war broke out. But I think basically this is where I started learning English. Then, with regard to the church, this was a church in our community. I was at the time a radio host in a community-based radio station called Radio Arc-en-Ciel in Abobo. Abobo is a large neighborhood in Abidjan. In fact, a poor neighborhood. So I was a community radio host at these radio stations, and I was, running a show, a talk show in English. So this led me to meet a lot of people who speak English, basically Liberian, Ghanaians, and Nigerians migrants who are in Cote d'Ivoire. And this is how I met this pastor who had a church. And yes, in fact, a strong bond was developed between us because he was, like a father, to some extent for me, oriented me, gave advices. So I used to go to his church, and because he was an English speaker, it was for me an opportunity to practice what I was learning, or I learned at school. So that's how I started practicing interpretation in this church. It's been really interesting because it also helped me to develop some capacities and competencies. I work at a time as an interpreter in a language firm in Abidjan, and I think this is something that contributed to this year to develop these competencies.
So 2011 was a presidential election between Alassane Ouattara and Laurent Gbagbo, and there was a lot of contention around that election that spilled into violence on the streets. Could you talk about what that election was like for you and for people who may not have any understanding of the background of what happened?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, Cote d'Ivoire is, has a specific history. Since the death of the first president, Houphouët-Boigny, in 1993, Cote d'Ivoire has barely experienced a peaceful election. In 2010, to be specific, there was this presidential election, which was the first election in a decade. Usually, normally elections are organized each 5 years, but because a rebellion broke out in 2002 in Cote d'Ivoire, conditions were not favorable, or at least politicians did not run elections up to 2010 after a long political talks, negotiations, and so a long political process. So there were a lot of hope that these elections in 2010 will bring about, stability and close the chapter of the rebellion that broke out in 2002. So there was a runoff between Alassane Ouattara, who is the current president, but at the time was the challenger, and the incumbent at the time was Laurent Gbagbo. So at the end of the elections, when at the end of the elections, there were mainly two national institutions who were in charge of organizing the elections. One proclaimed Alassane Ouattara as, the winner of the election. The other one, which was the Constitutional Court, proclaimed Laurent Gbagbo as the winner of the elections. But each institution was led by somebody who was close to the political party of each candidate. So it was a really, a confusing and complex situations. But instead of sitting down and trying to discuss or recount the ballots or find peaceful means to settle this issue, they chose to use violence. And at the time, the UN peacekeeping mission, France, and the international community as a whole supported Alassane Ouattara, who was the challenger, but also, was a figure of hope and change for many Ivorians and also for the international community. So they supported him, and unfortunately, this led to a war which claimed the life of about 3,000 people. At the time, I was at the university, and I was residing at a university, a student hostel in Cote. Basically, there was fightings, there was a fear, lootings, and all that comes with violence and uncontrolled, war around the city. So we feared for our lives, and because we were students, and students were, wrongly or rightfully, rightly accused of being supporters of Laurent Gbagbo, we were easy targets by fighters of the opposition at the time. So my brothers and I were obliged to flee to our village, where we stayed from March to July. And all this violence, which also even affected our region, but it was less in the inner country than in Abidjan. So when I came back, it was total chaos in the city. People were living in fear, in anxiety, in insecurity. And so it was really difficult. And, the social fabric, social cohesion or reconciliation, all these efforts that were undertaken previously, all was, turned down, destroyed. So it was quite a difficult moment. At the time, I was a radio host. We had a partnership with a few organizations at the time. So we started running radio programs to try to give a floor to the people to express the trauma that they experienced, but at the same time to heal and also to push for reconciliation, for forgiveness, and for social cohesion. Uh, Examples, of this anxiety and trauma, where that even when you will come with the sound recorder, the Zoom recorder to the people, they will refuse to talk, or sometimes they will even, they were reluctant because they fear that they will be targeted to some extent or not. So this was really difficult, but we push on, and there were also a lot of efforts like peace and reconciliation commissions that were put together by the government, international organizations supporting also the country. So progressively, life went back to normal. But at the, deeply, there are still wounds that are not even healed up to now. With regard to the 2015 elections, having been, my first encounter with war, was in newspapers, and it was fought thousands of miles away from where I was. But these were a lived experience of war. So seeing that election.
What do you
Yeah,
mean by 1,000 miles away from where you lived?
Yeah, I said that, when I was in primary school, I read about the Liberian War and the Sierra Leonean War. Sierra Leone and Liberia are away from where I was. So it wasn't,
That's the first time you heard
I
about
wasn't,
it. Got you.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But this time in 2011, I was, in the battleground, because the whole city was basically a battleground. And even, bullets were dropping in our hostel. So, and I also saw people shooting, others in the street. So these were a very, traumatizing, events. So in 2015, uh, there were another elections, and we saw that election periods are, could be easy triggers of violence and everything. So we started to produce radio programs to raise the awareness of the populations around the electoral process and everything. But we also realized that still sitting in the studio and speaking to the people or talking will not be effective if we do not find a way to go there in the community, discuss with the people, and have them express their minds. So we put together a project, and thankfully it was funded it was supported by the USAID at the time. So we organized an 8-month long program across this neighborhood of Abubo. We went everywhere, and we gave a floor to people to express their views, but also we provided accurate information about the electoral process, encouraging people to participate in the process in a way that is peaceful. And ultimately, the 2015 elections were peaceful. We cannot say that it's because of what we did that the elections were peaceful in the community, but we think that to some extent we contributed to something. And yeah, these were the experiences in 2015, but also at the same time, in 2015, the opposition was not this strong. So we think that these are some of the factors that contributed to a peaceful election in 2015.
and also a part of it was some events that brought together a lot of people and entertainment and messaging to just try to cool the place down a little bit. And a lot of Americans who are ignorant about the history of our own country here and about just the tenuous nature of power and political transitions, I think got a taste of the potential violence around elections here January 6th that we still haven't fully dealt with, and came very close, came 5 minutes away from actually locking our Congress in their chamber with thousands of people surrounding. And that could have been a very, very bloody day in this nation's history. And I think a lot of people don't really want to think about what could have happened, but we dodged a bullet on January 6th.
Yeah.
So that's just saying from this point in, there's a lot of ignorance about just the political transition process and how many things need to be put in place to ensure that one side of the losing side can't mount an offensive like that. So just moving on to this book that you wrote and you just released it, I believe. Could you talk about that and what it's about?
Well, in the same vein with our efforts around elections in the lead up to the 2020 presidential elections, I initiated this collective book project as a way of inviting Ivorian youth to come together, express their views, their hopes, their opinions, but also call on the political leaders to engage in this process with the best interests of the people in mind, because our generation has been a whole generation of crisis. I was born in the late 80s. All the way from the 80s to now, the country has known but all sort of crisis. So this generation has a way and wanted to pass across a message to the political leaders that we are fed up with violence around the elections, but unfortunately it wasn't this peaceful. So ultimately 14 young Ivorian leaders and some leaders from other nationalities submitted write-ups which were selected, and we published a book which is entitled Côte d'Ivoire, pour que demain soit meilleur, des voix pour la paix. In English, it will be Côte d'Ivoire for a brighter future, Voices for Peace. And it was published by the French editor, Edelive, in October 2020. It's a combination of different literary genres and styles, which is, a kind of portrayal of the Ivorian diversity, which is one of our, assets as a nation. Okay. Yeah, it also conveys messages to the political class, asking them to adhere to peace, democracy, and to place people, at the heart of whatever they want to achieve. So this was basically what we did around the elections. But unfortunately, the elections were not peaceful, even though the crisis, the post-electoral crisis of 2020 was not long-lived, but it was an indicator that elections are a fragile moments, or at least we choose election moment to, to fight or try to revenge. So this is it.
So I do want to talk about the economy, because Cote d'Ivoire was one of the wealthiest economies in West Africa and all of Africa in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. And then obviously issues happened with oil and IMF and other things like that. But to just kind of close out this questioning about the election, so former President Gbagbo was extradited to The Hague in November 2011, where he was charged with crimes against humanity in the International Criminal Court. I think, just a side note, it's pretty telling that only African leaders have gone through the ICC. And even though there was a lot of issues around the Iraq War in this country, but that's just a side note.
If they deserve, they will go.
Yeah, well, I think more than just African leaders deserve maybe a truth and reconciliation. But so Gbagbo was the first former head of state to be taken into the court's custody of the ICC. And in 2019, January, the ICC panel dismissed the charges because the evidence presented was insufficient to prove he committed crimes against humanity, according to the ICC. And this month, April 2021, President Ouattara stated Gbagbo is free to return to Cote d'Ivoire. And as you mentioned, in 2015, the Gbagbo opposition was pretty much decimated at that time. And that may have been a response to one of the reasons why things were much more peaceful. I'm just curious if you would want to share any thoughts about this development or what you're hearing.
Well, thank you so much. Seriously, I think this should not have happened. This should never happen. That an Ivorian leader is sent to the ICC to be prosecuted. But as I said, I think earlier, the political class have failed the people in Cote d'Ivoire. So this trial of Laurent Gbagbo was not much about the trial of the crime that were committed, but it was the trial of the whole political class. So it was the trial of a whole generation, of the older generation of leaders who lacked the love of the people, the love of the country. So they rule visionless, they rule with their own interest in mind. So yeah, I think this was all about the trial. So what happened there was the trial of a failure of this class, of this political generation, the older generation. But we hope that, with this acquittal and release, it will bring some form of, understanding to these leaders, but at the same time, it will bring about reconciliation within the country. But I doubt that this will happen, because, when you listen to the narratives, to what is said, you understand that nobody, draw lessons from all these bloody, events that mark the history of the country. So, it's also a fact that with the election of President Ouattara in 2010, there were a lot of hope of change. But yeah, there were a few notable efforts, but the old demons survived. We still have corruption, a lot of corruption. We still have sectarian narrative. We still have lack of opportunities for the youth, lack of hope and security. So nothing has changed. And yeah.
So when I spoke with you in 2015, you talked about the political transition, but you also emphasized that this is just one small moment. The bigger aspect is the economy, that the youth need jobs, need development, need sovereignty to have your own manufacturing base, to have your own energy base, and all of these other things. And Cote d'Ivoire was an economic powerhouse in West Africa during the 60s and 70s, and then went through the economic crisis that so many countries in Africa did in the 1980s due to IMF structural adjustment programs that said you have to cut social services to pay interest on these loans to these banks. And I read it wasn't not until around 2014 that the gross domestic product reached the level of its peak in the 1970s. So that's over 30 years of stagnation. So you still have some of the most important farming in the world. You're still the nation that is the largest cocoa producer. Could you talk about the policies that can improve the economic prosperity of the people of Cote d'Ivoire?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. Since the independence up to even now, the country has relied on the production and export of commodities, raw materials, for its economy. As you know, raw materials cannot sustain, cannot bring about sustainable development to a country or economic growth. So in terms of reform, I think there is, and the choices in terms of our economy were from the colonial era. Colonial powers impose a form of agriculture that will, benefit them, but not benefit the people. And when we got independences, unfortunately, many of the African countries continued in the same, direction. They did not change anything to the extent that now most of what we produce, as country, we do not consume this. We export everything, and it's not even manufactured to add any value. So we export everything as raw commodities and items, and it doesn't have any value. At the same time, we use this money, and we even borrow money to buy food from outside, which is ridiculous. Like a country like Cote d'Ivoire, which has, the capacity or the potential to produce rice and even sell to other countries, import rice from China, from Japan, from Thailand, from Vietnam. It doesn't make sense, but it's, it is based on the political orientation. So there is a need, at least if you want to keep on producing cocoa, coffee, and other form of timber and everything, we need to find a way to process some of these so that we add value. Otherwise, we could even choose to produce what we can consume for the local market, so that there is a form of, internal growth and self-sufficiency in terms of food. Because anytime there is a crisis like the COVID crisis we are going on, if we rely on the outside to feed our people, we are in trouble. So I think there is kind of, making strong decisions and encouraging decisions to orient our economic choices toward the needs of the people and toward the real needs of a country. So in terms of, growth and development, we need also to invest a lot in human development. We have a lot of potential, but if the education system is not strong, if the health system is not strong, at least in terms of energy, we have done well, but there are more that we can still do, more that we can still do, producing energy for and selling to other countries across Africa and everything. These are going to produce a lot of wealth for the country, and the potential is there. The know-how is there. The youth. We have a lot of manpower, and these people can work. So it's a matter of education, a matter of giving them the opportunity, and then they can show what they can do. So there is a need to invest heavily in education, in the health system, and also with the help of technology. I think a lot of opportunities will be available.
So you almost answered my next question, but for the audience that doesn't understand this concept of resource and commodity extraction, most of the value comes in the processing, and that's where you were talking about the value addition. So that instead of just exporting cocoa beans, raw chocolate beans, you actually create the confectioner and chocolates within Cote d'Ivoire, and then that value is 10 times more than just a cocoa bean. If not, and you're also increasing the skill set, and you need machinery and mechanisms, and you increase efficiencies. So it should absolutely be based in Cote d'Ivoire instead of going all the way to Switzerland or France or anywhere else around there. So how can France, the US, and China play a positive role? I think you've already indicated this.
Yeah, I think there are two or three things that many African countries needs from our partners, France and the US. I think there is a stronger need to support the call of the population for more accountability, for the fight against corruptions. Because many of our countries are poor not because we don't have resources, but they are poor because of corruptions. And corruption is the first hindrance of development in our countries. So if the fight against corruption can be tightened and our leaders can be held accountable, I think many things will change. So we rely on the US and France especially because uh, yeah, at the same time, most of this money which is embezzled by African elites go to Europe in European banks or buying assets in Europe and everything where there is stability. And this doesn't make sense. So if really Europe or the US want to help Africa, I think instead of even bringing aid and development aid, there should be more concentration of effort in fighting against corruption, and you will see that Africa would not need much aid. Yeah, this is one thing. The other thing is that, especially for European countries and former colonial powers, there is no balance in terms of, who wins in trade, who wins in economic negotiations. And this, maybe it worked. It worked for the older generations, but for the younger generation, we can no more work. It cannot work anymore because, I cannot understand why in Niger, a French company will come extract the uranium and then Niger gets only 7% or 17%. It is ridiculous. So there is a kind to be, a renegotiation or a rethinking of our partnership and collaborations to go towards something like win-win. I think this is something that we really need to. With regard to China, I think, there is a need for them, to play with the best interests of the people in mind, because the Africans that they are meeting now are no more the Africans of the early 20s or 30s, which were not educated and you could exploit so easily. So there is now a cry from civil societies for more transparency, for better business practices with regard to Chinese deals with African government. And these are some of the governments who are corrupt will not last forever. So if China want to build strong relationship with Africa, they need to bring in transparency, bring in a mind of win-win other than, this form of sharp power of trying to trick people and take advantage of the assets. This cannot last.
And if I can just add on two pieces, on the corruption piece, I read somewhere that the corporations don't pay their taxes in a lot of these international situations. And if they, for instance, in Africa, if the corporations that are extracting just paid what they're supposed to pay in taxes, that would be something like 5 times more than all the international aid that is going to Africa. So let's just, I think that's even a bigger corruption than in the national individual level. And absolutely deal with the individual corruption that are moving their money into the French banks through a lot of the francophone African franc attached to the French banking system. But the corporations have to pay their taxes, and that's a form of corruption as well. And then the idea of every time a commodity leaves the continent or a country in the continent, then physical gold should be shipped into the country. And this idea was thought about and very articulated by Gaddafi of Libya. And he had this idea of the African gold dinar, where anytime commodities left, it wasn't going to be something like, okay, we're going to forgive some debt, or it's going to be this electronic thing. No, it's going to be the amount of wealth being taken out has to come back in actual physical gold that's going to be held into a central bank to actually strengthen the currency for internal improvements and investments in an African bank. That's something that that would increase at least some equality while trying to improve the actual domestic manufacturing and value added. I don't know if you've heard about that before.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. But I think tax exemption to some extent help develop or encourage companies to come and build, manufacturers and industries in the country and create jobs. So to some extent, this could be accepted. But yes, all these also needs to be negotiated well with the interest of the people in mind. I think this is it.
So turning to another piece that you wrote, the title is, "What if Ufwebonyi was not the man of peace we were made to believe?" That's probably a very controversial question in some places. Could you talk about what your argument is on this?
Well, thank you.
And who the founding father was, or one of the first presidents?
Yeah, Ufwebonyi, as you said, was the founding father of Cote d'Ivoire. He was the first head of state of the country from the independence in 1960 up to 1993 when he died. So, despite a form of iron fist rule, and also clampdowns on oppositions and even the communities of opposition leaders, he succeeded to build for himself a kind of reputation of a peaceful person, a peaceful leader, and even an icon of peace. He was held as an example in Africa, and he even invested a lot of time and effort and energy in trying to settle to some extent the issue around Israel and Palestine, and even in some African countries. So in this respect, people uh, celebrate him as an artisan of peace, as he was called in Cote d'Ivoire. But then, this is a fault for people of our generation. We did not know him much. He died when I was 6 years old, so I cannot say anything about or not. All I know was about what was told to me, what I read, and what I saw. But so to some extent, the relative stability of a country for these 3 decades, uh, contributed also to build this reputation, because the whole West African region was affected by war and conflict, and Cote d'Ivoire remained like an island of, of peace. Yeah, but since he died, since he passed away, the country has barely known peace. And ironically, at the same time, all these political leaders who are fighting or have been fighting since Ofe passed away claim to be the disciples, the disciples of Ofe. So I was thinking, how can a peaceful person who is celebrated as an icon of peace produce such bellicose, such warlike leaders, also such warlike disciples? So this was, this what I wanted to. It was a kind of questioning. I wanted to question why can somebody who is renowned or celebrated as an icon of peace, and there is even an international peace prize by UNESCO in his name. Why can this person produce warlike leaders and disciples who have been, destroying his heritage since he passed away? Or is it because, these disciples were not actual disciples, or because, Ufwebonyi himself was not really a man of peace? So, this was a form of questioning, but it resonates a lot with the people of my generation, because you cannot uh, you cannot live in a country which was, supposed to be the place of peace for everybody, and then know only crisis and war throughout. I'm in my 30s and barely I can recount 5 years in a row in Cote d'Ivoire when we did not know or experience conflict or a form of violence. Yeah, this is it.
Well, I'll definitely put the essay in the show notes. And for the non-French speakers, there's a very easy Google Translate too, so anyone can read it as well in many different languages.
Thank you.
So I really appreciate your time. There's only a few more questions left. You're right now in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. As some people who know, that's one of the richest places in the world for rare earth minerals and gold deposits. And a lot of the rare earth minerals are exported through the east, through Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and goes right to China. China often manufactures it, and then it ends up in the cell phones in the US and around the world, and many different other technologies. So could you just talk a little bit about what you're seeing there? Because there's also been a tremendous long-term long-term warfare, long-term violence, strife, different folks fighting over different places, and there's no weapons manufacturers in Eastern Africa. So a lot of it's coming from Russia, the US, China, elsewhere. So I would like to just, for the audience to just kind of maybe open their eyes to what you're seeing and your experience.
Thank you. Like many countries in Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo is, another country with huge potentialities and abundance of resources, be it natural resources, human resources, and everything. I think what this country and like many African countries, what they really need is human development, more investment in human development, and this is what could help this country overcome some of the issues it is facing. But I cannot talk more about about this.
So I wrote and did some studies on the Inga Dam project on the Congo River. And if that level of infrastructure was put in, it would create something like 45 gigawatts of electricity that could go into internal developments and improvements, not just in the Democratic Republic of Congo, not just in creating manufacturing that can then do value add for all of the minerals wealth in and around Africa, but it could be exported and could really electrify the entire continent. And I know a lot of people are against dams, a lot of people are against development, but something like that could be a godsend from what I've studied and researched. So, that's been talked about for 50, 60 years now, but maybe one day, and if not that, got to get more energy and electricity and production into Africa. So a couple more questions and then we're done. So many Americans are ignorant about Africa. So what would you like people to know? I know that's a super broad general question. And I know there's so much diversity, but I'm just curious if you could share your thoughts for these folks outside who just have no understanding.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. This debate questions of Americans not knowing Africa, has gone on for a while, But I wanted to say that Africa is, a land of opportunity. The future of the world is, in fact, in Africa, and the only thing that Africa needs, leaders with vision and new forms of partnership that is built on equality, on respect and shared prosperity. People have to come to Africa. When they come to Africa, they will love it, definitely. Why? Because all these, problems and issues that we face here in Africa are business opportunities, are opportunities to to develop something for even them to gain, but also for the continent and for its people also to gain. So there is opportunity everywhere, and people have to visit, and they will definitely love Africa. It's a land of opportunity with a welcoming climate and seasons, and the diversity, the people, the colors, and everything is it's a wealth that people discover.
So, is there anything else you would like to add in closing?
Well, I think we have to close with hope, with hope in mind, and I want to say that in Africa I see opportunity and opportunities everywhere, in every square centimeter of Africa. I see hope in the children. I see hope in young people, in the new generation of leaders in all sectors: economy, politics, social, and everywhere. I see hope in the natural resources of the DRC. I see hope in the buoyant, youth of Nigeria who are really creative. I see hope in the new peace deals that has been harbored between Ethiopia and Eritrea. I see hope in the concerted fight against violent extremism in the Sahel region and the Lake Chad Basin. I see hope in the demonstration and determination of women to get access to opportunities and education, and in the call of the youth and civil society actors for more equal, just, and freer societies in countries everywhere, in Burkina Faso, in Senegal, in everywhere, and in the creativity, innovation, and thirst for knowledge that is seen everywhere across the continent. I see also hope, in the eagerness of young Kenyans to walk in the feet of Wangari Maathai. And today is Earth Day, the 22nd of April. So there is hope everywhere, in every square centimeter of Africa, and we have to make this hope real for everybody, for the benefit of the world, but also for the benefit of Africa. Thank you.